Time to get started. This is Tim Hoagland over at CDT. I'm the Interim Director of Communications, and we're very, very excited to host this chat today. Our student privacy team has been working exceptionally hard over the last few months to meet the demands of the moment, meet the demands of education practitioners as the world rapidly changes in the education space. And the person leading that team is Elizabeth Laird, and I will hand the reins right over to her. Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on the coast that you're on. I know that everyone is very, very busy, and so finding an hour to participate in this is not lost on me. So thank you for taking your time to join today. I am, as Tim said, I'm Elizabeth Laird. I lead the Student Privacy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm very excited to welcome you to our webinar today. I do have a few housekeeping items to get through before we dive into the good stuff, into the content. Just for folks to know, we are recording today's webinar. It's a best practice when you're doing that to let people know. So please be advised that we are recording it. And we'll share that with all of you who have registered for today, as well as make it available on our website. So hopefully it'll be a resource that we can all continue to look back on and find value in. The last portion of our webinar, and hopefully the majority of it, is going to be a discussion based. So we want to make sure that we are answering and responding to the questions and the topics on your mind. Because folks are joining in different ways, I wanted to make sure you know how to submit questions. So as Tim mentioned, you can do that during the chat if you're participating in the computer version, but you're also able to submit questions to the email address that he mentioned, which is questions@cdt.org. Or you can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CDT questions and mentioning us, which is @SemDemTech. We are going to receive questions in that way, so just respectfully and graciously ask you to keep yourself on mute given the number of participants that we have, to make sure that everybody can hear the content that's being shared. All right, so with that, let's get started. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists for today. We are going to be joined by Erin Moat, and when thinking about this topic with Erin, one of the reasons I wanted her to be a part of this discussion is in one person you get many perspectives. So for those of you who are not familiar with Erin, she is executive director of an organization called Innovate EDU. But as part of that, she runs an initiative called Project Unicorn that is about supporting the interoperability of education data systems while making sure that privacy and security are protected. She is also a leader of a charter network of schools in Brooklyn, New York. So wears the hat of a practitioner as well. She is a founder of an initiative called Educating All, that is specifically focused on students with disabilities, which we'll talk about is a main consideration when thinking about technology and data. And I hope she's okay with sharing this too. One of the other hats I'm hoping that she can also speak to is she's a mother of school-age children. So not only is she leading some of this work, she is on the receiving end of it as well. And so I'm just very excited to have her be part of this conversation. In addition to Erin, we are joined by Marcia Bohannon, who is the Chief Information Officer at the Colorado Department of Education. I personally came to know Erin when I was still working in states. For those of you whom I haven't met, I worked at the Louisiana Department of Education as well as DC's State Education Agency on data technology and privacy issues. And Marcia and I connected over both having to navigate pretty restrictive student privacy bills and how do you implement those in such a way that privacy is protected, but at the same time, all of the benefits of data technology and how they can improve student outcomes. We don't lose those in the process. So our agenda for today, I'm going to give a brief presentation that is an excerpt of some training that we released last week on how policymakers and practitioners can navigate student privacy issues in the context of COVID-19. So to do that, I'm going to start with, at a very high level, what are some of the legal issues and ethical guidelines. What is privacy? Why does it matter? Why is this coming up now? Put forward some steps that we're recommending practitioners take to respond to the unique privacy concerns that are being presented from the rapid shift to distance learning as a result of the global pandemic. But I also recognize, at my position at CDT, having been in this position at a national organization offering guidance and being responsible for implementing it in a state, that we have a distinct privilege, which I think we take very seriously, of being able to offer guidance, but also recognize that we're not the ones who actually need to change practices and change policies and change the way that we think and work on these issues. And so what I hope Aaron and Marcia will contribute, among many things, is just, what is this really like on the ground? Of our recommendations, how is that going? Where do you start? What are the challenges? So really keeping it real. And then we'll wrap up with questions from you all. Okay, so with that, I am going to dive in. So we're going to start by talking about the importance of protecting student privacy. And seeing who's joined this webinar, I don't expect this to be a surprise or any breaking news to anyone, but I do think it's important to anchor the conversation and why are we talking about this and why does it matter? So in terms of privacy, one of the things that we're really aimed at trying to protect here is an individual's ability to control their own information and what happens with it. And so in the case of education, we're talking about protecting the rights of students and their families to do what's best for them. And when I would, give training on this, I would ask who are the privacy rights we're talking about? And I would get answers like the state, the district, the government. No, this is about students and families being able to make choices about what is in their best interest. So to ensure that happens, as you all know, there are legal obligations that need to be met in order to protect student privacy. The good news is that these rules have not changed as a result of the pandemic. They are not more restrictive. They are not more permissive. They are the same. And every state and local education agency, so school districts and charter management organizations, have navigated them before. So they're not new. And even just beyond legal compliance, and I think what we care deeply about at CDT and the mission of our project is not only just meeting legal obligations, but also making sure, and maybe more importantly, ensuring that any use of technology and data is in no way endangering or jeopardizing the well-being of students and their families. So in terms of how we're entering this conversation, we are entering it from a perspective of centering students and their families, making sure, of course, that we are legally compliant, but even beyond that, being sort of laser focused on making sure we're keeping students safe and protecting their well-being, which is, all the more critical given the national crisis that we are in the midst of. Some of you may have seen some of these headlines before, but student privacy has been in the news lately, and not for necessarily getting it right. But in the transition from convening students in person and school buildings to moving a lot of that online, there have been new issues that have been arising, and I think at CDT, and it's not specific to education, it applies to all of our projects. We're concerned that in moments of crisis, like what we're experiencing right now, it is in those moments that it's most likely for privacy and civil rights to be sacrificed, either because they become a lower priority or because people are more willing to give them up if they believe it will keep them safer. So some of the examples here demonstrate how these can be legal violations, but more than that, and what's more important is that they could actually harm students. So exposing students to inappropriate content. In this case of Florida, a man actually was able to expose himself in an online classroom, potentially outing transgender students. I hope you can tell we pick these examples because they're not only potential legal violations, but have a direct and negative and potentially harmful impact on students. And that is the problem that we're trying to solve. So I'm going to briefly talk about state and federal compliance. For those of you who are lawyers and work on these issues a lot, this is not going to be probably as much detail as you might like or think is needed to necessarily address these in a legal way, but just to touch on them at a high level today. So one concept that's super important to understand in education, and that I know many of you are very familiar with this acronym, which is personally identifiable information, or PII. That is what we're trying to protect. That's information that can be linked to an individual. And it doesn't have to just be, in my case, Elizabeth Laird. It can be, a number of demographic factors that, when combined with other information that's known in the community, would be able to be tied back to me. That's what this is. That's what we're trying to protect. In the context of COVID-19, I think it's important to remember that personally identifiable information doesn't just live as in a row in a data system, but it can be in lots of different kinds of media. And I think we're seeing that in terms of video conferencing and screenshots and photos. So having an inclusive definition of the kinds of data that we need to be thinking about, and that it may not always be the data we've historically been thinking about and trying to protect. And then as part of this, recognizing and paying attention to what are new elements that have been introduced and are being collected as a result of COVID-19. So that can include, whether a student has tested positive for COVID-19. Another issue we're seeing is teachers taking screenshots of online classes and sharing them online. If those images have students in them, that is personally identifiable information that needs to be protected. And so the point of this is to say that, we need to protect this kind of information in a virtual environment in the same way that we would protect this kind of information in a physical environment. So at a very high level, and again, there's a lot to the federal landscape and the state landscape, but just to highlight the main things that will come into play here. One is, the main federal student privacy law, which is FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It is exclusively concerned with personally identifiable information about students. So in terms of what we need to protect, that's what we're focused on. The structure of the law is that it generally prohibits sharing student data without consent, but it does have limited exceptions. And when you hear about a school district contracting with a vendor or using video conferencing or using Google Classroom, they are most likely using one of those limited exceptions. And the one that is most commonly invoked as it relates to sharing data with a third party without consent is a school official exception. But in order for a school or an LEA to use that school official exception, which means that they could share that data without parental consent, the third party must have a legitimate educational interest. So you can't share that personally identifiable information if the purpose is going to be used for something beyond education. They have to perform a service that an LEA would otherwise provide, and they have to maintain direct control of that student data. So it's not a blank check where you can just share data. There are some restrictions around that. And we'll talk about in the recommendations how, as I said, the laws haven't changed, but you also need to think about these requirements when you're deploying technology in new ways that maybe you haven't in the past. And so if that's not enough, at the state level, there are a myriad of state student privacy bills. 45 states have passed at least one, and states have passed many versions. I've worked in some of those states. So across the country, we have enacted almost 130 state student privacy bills as it relates to student privacy. So if you're thinking about legal compliance, you need to not just be thinking about federal laws, but also at the state level, and be aware of, how those intersect and how they may be even more restrictive than what is permitted at the federal level. So now I'm going to shift to some steps that we're recommending policymakers and practitioners take to protect student privacy during COVID-19. And as I said at the beginning, and I'll highlight it at the end, we came out with an online training module that goes a little bit deeper into each of these steps and offers some additional resources as well as an interactive quiz. So I'm going to keep this at a higher level so we can make sure to have plenty of time for discussion. But this is a resource, it's pulling from a resource that we developed to really support and build capacity at the local level to navigate some of these issues. So in thinking about the steps that are needed to be taken, both in terms of ensuring legal compliance, but also in terms of truly protecting students and their families in this moment. We are putting forth six steps, and would love your feedback and reactions to them. And I'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. But the first is to think about governance, which is, I don't know, maybe a fancy word to think about the people, the processes, and the structures that you have in place to navigate these questions and concerns. The second is just thinking about training and making sure you're proactively communicating, because a number of the issues that we're seeing are really just a result of human error and a really rapid shift to using data and technology without equipping practitioners to do it well and safely. The third is to look at agreements. If you think back to what I just talked about in terms of FERPA and maintaining direct control of the data, agreements are an important tool in doing that. The fourth is around video conferencing, which is, in terms of the media and some of the national stories, there have been a number of instances of video conferencing issues that have resulted in harm to students. The fifth is thinking about data deletion, and sixth, which is really, under everything that we do. And I know what Marcia and Aaron and many of my fellow practitioners think about is just equity, and making sure that any use of technology and data is not having a disproportionate negative impact on any group of students. So just to go a little bit into more detail about thinking about governance structures, this is a really important step right now, because it is the way through which practitioners and policymakers can make decisions about how they use technology and data and protect privacy in the process. And I think this is so important because there are a number of issues that have come up that were unanticipated. There will be more issues that come up that are not anticipated. And so having in place a structure through which you can have these discussions and make these decisions is really important. And I think the good news here, as I said before, because privacy is not a new function in education, some states and some LEAs will have existing processes and people with subject matter expertise in these areas. And now is the moment to lean on those more than ever. And if you don't have them, it's the right time to put those kinds of things in place. And then in terms of, additional considerations, I hear a lot about states and districts standing up working groups or governance committees to oversee their distance learning initiatives. And so it's important that any working group that is addressing these issues incorporate privacy as part of that. And one of the challenges I hear is that, a decision will be made about technology, and it won't be until it's actually being deployed that we'll think about some of the privacy implications. And so making sure that those are discussed at the front end, and the way that you do that is have in place the right people and processes and structures to have that conversation. The second step, which is also very important, is to train and communicate with educators. And that is important because most educators, and when I say educators, I'm thinking about, folks at the school level. So be it principals or be it, teachers in the classroom, most of them don't have a background in privacy or security. And as I mentioned before, many of the data breaches that we've seen historically in education, and certainly recently, are the result of human error. And that happens when you turn over a new tool to someone and you don't tell them or train them on how to keep students and families safe in the process. And so training can really help with that. And so it can help them understand, just the basics of how to, secure any kind of platform that they're using, and just making sure that they're implementing best practices. And if not, I think it leads to some of the issues that we've seen around just making mistakes or not understanding how a system works and allowing there to be some kind of breach in that process. And then in particular, when you're thinking about training, some issues that we've seen that require special attention or focus. One is video conferencing. Again, a lot of the issues that we've seen in the media are issues of tools not being configured correctly, which allows an uninvited participant to join an online classroom and maybe share inappropriate content. We've also seen issues of educators posting screenshots of their students. And lastly, another issue that we hear about is, teachers, selecting their own, their own applications or their own systems. and maybe sharing personally identifiable information. And the risk there is that they likely don't have the skill set to evaluate the privacy and security practices of that organization, which could potentially jeopardize some of that information and also obligate legally a school or a district because they would have signed on behalf of that entity. This third step is about ensuring appropriate agreements and contracts, which I don't know, I guess for the lawyers on the call, maybe seem obvious and really helpful. I think if you have maybe a background as an educator, they seem less intuitive, but they are really important. They've always been important before the pandemic, and they're even more important now as a way to document and agree on what the expectations are related to how data and technology will be used and how any third party that has access to personally identifiable information will keep that information safe. And again, it just helps clarify for vendors and education institutions how data can and can't be used, which is really important. And then, as I mentioned before, in terms of FERPA, and if you are using that school official exception, an agreement can be a really important way and a really helpful way to maintain direct control of that data, because you have documented your expectations and how that vendor can or can't use that data. And then in terms of agreements, one issue that we're also seeing that is particularly important is that we're seeing more products and services that were not designed for educational purposes being used in the context of distance learning. And so the issue with that is that if a company is designing a product for education, they are hopefully and likely knowledgeable about what some of those legal requirements are. But if you develop something for a consumer-facing product, you may not have developed it with those things in mind. And so being even more discriminate and careful about what those, how that company, consumer-facing company handles data is going to be really important. The fourth step, we are calling out video conferencing separately, just because there have been so many high-profile and reported issues around this. And it does appear to be, pretty widespread in terms of its utility, not just for, synchronous instruction, but also just for maintaining relationships between teachers and their students, which is, really important. But, the utility of them is being undermined by some of the issues that we've seen in the media. And it's not just been about, someone coming into an online classroom and harassing them. We've also seen issues of bullying, where students are able to bully each other by choosing offensive screen names or bullying each other in the chat. And so, video conferencing can be a really helpful way to maintain relationships and communications between students and their teachers. It doesn't come without its risks. And so one of the main things to do here is to make sure that you have the right agreements in place with these vendors, because many of them were not developed with an educational purpose in mind, and that you configure these in such a way that you are preventing any unwanted participants from joining. They are not able to share their screens or record without permission. They can't, bully each other in chats or choose offensive screen names. They're not able to initiate sessions without being supervised. So a lot of that comes down to the technical configurations of these tools. The fifth step that I want to talk about is data deletion and how important that is. This is not a new issue for our project. We wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago, but it's only more important now that data is being shared with new kinds of organizations and for different purposes. And so this is important because, one, there's a legal aspect to it, which is that if there's no longer a need for a vendor to have that data for an educational purpose, they must delete it. So that is a legal requirement. Even if it wasn't a legal requirement, it is a best practice, because one of the issues that we hear from students and their families is that they are concerned about students accumulating a permanent record or information being used out of context to potentially limit opportunities for them. And so what sounds like maybe a technical or a wonky issue is actually really important. And it is through deletion and not keeping data past its utility that you can really address those concerns from students and their families. And again, this comes back to having that expectation clear at the beginning, which you can document in an agreement. but also making sure you're employing the best policy and technical practices when that data is actually being deleted. It's not as easy as dragging a file to your desktop, as much as I wish that was true. And then the last issue that I want to highlight before I turn it over to my fellow panelists is equity. Equity is so core to what we all do. And I think it's never been more pronounced than it is right now, both in education and in our country. And so that extends to distance learning. And so the two equity issues I want to make sure to highlight, and that as you're thinking about using data and technology are on all of our radars. One is just the issue of the digital divide, and that not everyone has access to devices that they can use to support distance learning. They don't have access to the kind of broadband that is needed to support distance learning. Another issue is also with different needs of students, which I'm hoping Erin will talk about. But students with disabilities, some of these tools may not be designed for different groups of students in mind. They may not have the appropriate accommodations. Similar with English language learners. How many of these tools are really available in all the languages that are spoken by your students and your families? So thinking about both of those dimensions of equity when you're thinking about how data and technology can be used in this moment. And so in terms of the first step to that is just know what you're dealing with. Understand what the level of access to devices and internet is, as well as the different kinds of needs that your students have, and being thoughtful and deliberate about that throughout the process. So I know that was a lot of information, and believe it or not, there's actually a more detailed training on that. Just thank you for bearing with us. I do want to turn it over to my panelists now. I've prepared some guiding questions for them to respond to, but would also welcome participants to start chatting those questions, to start tweeting, to send them to questions@cdt.org. But with that, Erin and Marcia, are you all unmuted and ready to dive in and talk about what this has been like in the field?
Yeah.
Awesome.
We're here.
Great. So as I started with, I have the luxury of being in a national organization and saying, this is how I think things should go. So let's hear how they've actually been going. So in terms of student privacy issues, have you seen unintended consequences of the way data and technology have been used?
I think the answer is yes. I will share a couple of, I think, the main issues I'm seeing right now, both in my experience as a mother of now a kindergartner. We had pre-K4 graduation yesterday, so we're into kindergarten. Yes. But I'm the mother of a student in the New York City DOE, and so rapidly experienced the transition to remote learning while also working with the charter schools that I founded to make that transition. But more broadly, I think we're seeing a couple big things happening, particularly as it relates to COVID. So in a rapid transition to remote learning, particularly for schools who weren't using a ton of digital tools before, there's a huge use of consumer tech without an understanding of how to manage permissions. So the technology we're on right now, Zoom, is a consumer technology, or this is Cisco WebEx, but Zoom is another one of those, consumer technologies that's being used without teachers having, I think, and principals having adequate training around how to configure permission levels, how to set up waiting rooms, how to mute and unmute students during discussion. And so that's a huge challenge for so many schools and districts. And because many of them, were in school on Friday, for example, in New York, and found out school was not going to be in session starting on Monday, there was not a lot of time to think about that training, that upskilling of our educators that I think is necessary. I also see teachers leaning on and using other consumer technology like Echo, Dots, and Alexa, and other tools like that for students to complete assignments and to do that work. And I think, again, those are places where those products we need to be really attentive when it comes to those products, because they don't have the same type of experience of an ed tech product in the space, with the types of considerations around FERPA and other state and federal laws. The intersection between FERPA and HIPAA, particularly as it relates to student health and safety, and students testing positive, or in New York, we've had to deal with students being in a household where a parent, guardian, or maybe cousin, household member tests positive. And so our health department declares that entire house a presumptive positive without a test. And so how to communicate that to school communities has been something that I think, again, a lot of schools have struggled with.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the third thing has been really difficult for our community at Brooklyn Lab, which is when your community loses a member of our community loses their life and to this disease. How do you communicate that to your community in a way that you can support them, in a way that doesn't sort of reveal maybe pre-existing conditions or contributing factors? When kids, parents, students, teachers are asking questions like why? These are really hard issues, and we've had to confront them in the field in Brooklyn. And I know many educators, superintendents across the country are confronting these really tough issues. And so I think there's things we can do, but those would be the sort of big things that have come up that are very COVID specific. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you. I think sometimes privacy can feel like legalistic or wonky. So thank you in your comments for bringing it back to like the impact on individuals and communities and families. Because I think that is just so important to keep in mind right now. Marcia, so from the state level in Colorado, what are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of privacy issues and maybe unintended consequences?
Well, I think you've walked through them actually pretty well, but just to repeat the challenge of all of the additional technology that's being used now and the speed at which teachers and schools had to all of a sudden use them, what that created was kind of we forget how we do these things. In other words, we had processes in place to cover all of these kinds of issues and challenges, but because of the speed at which, like Erin said, they went to school on Friday and then now they're not going back on Monday. So it all happened so fast. We kind of forgot that we have a structure in place and that we have, for all of your 6 points that you made, these are all things that we already know how to do. Besides, maybe with the exception of the equity, we're still all working on that. But we know how to do this. We've put processes in place. We do the agreements. We build data deletion plans, but we sort of forgot it in the haste. And I say we generally, it was just very easy to do that because everybody was so conscious of getting the schools or getting the kids back to a learning environment. So it was all for good reason, and everybody wanted to do the right thing, but some of these processes and steps were seen as very onerous and sort of legalistic, like you said, and so they didn't really want to follow that. And oftentimes didn't have the knowledge or the awareness that they needed to do it, because so much now is in the hands of teachers, left to them to, you figure it out, now we'll do it online, and they didn't have the resources necessarily. So that goes back to the training you're talking about.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that we've seen that is probably been an eye-opener has been the equity issues, and that is we've still got over 50,000 kids that we have not been able to identify actually where they are, because they don't, either the families don't have internet access, or they can't afford to pay for it, or they may not have devices. What somewhere in that supply chain of getting internet to the student in the home, someplace it's broken. And so we're, the good news is everybody really chipped in at the very beginning and said, we're ready to donate, we're ready to buy devices. which is good. And devices are things you can see and feel, and you can go buy them and say, here you go. The challenge is with the folks that don't have the internet access, because there's a lot of different possibilities of why they don't have it. So we're still trying to work through that after a couple months, still trying to figure out exactly where those gaps are and how we can get the money that is being offered up by philanthropists and state and other organizations to the right place so that we can, fill that gap. And then the longer we don't fill that gap, the more the equity problems show up, because there are so many kids that just are unaccounted for and they don't have the same opportunity.
Yeah.
So those are probably the two biggest ones that I've seen.
Yeah, that's so important. And did you say 50,000? What was the number you said? 50,000 students?
Right. It's around 50,000.
That what though?
That do not have access to internet.
Yeah.
In our state.
Out of how many students does Colorado serve?
I think it's around 800,000, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. I want to pick up on something that Erin mentioned, which is some of the data sharing, and especially as we look ahead to schools reopening and thinking about new uses of data and technology. I've heard about early warning systems. You hear about different kinds of apps. So in thinking ahead, both in terms of what you're thinking about in Colorado and what you're thinking about in New York, what are some issues that you see on the horizon about the new ways that data and technology are being proposed to be used?
I'll kick us off. I mean, I just got pitched the other day for a really amazing facial recognition kiosk to take the temperature of staff and the 1,200 students who will go to Brooklyn Lab in grades 6 through 12. And wouldn't it be great if we could put these kiosks not only inside the school, but outside the school, so that kids in the building with temperature screening would be much easier. And we could store up to 3,000 facial images. And isn't that great?
You got it, right?
Right. I immediately snapped it up. No, I did not. Neither did our board. But, if I'm getting that pitch, then superintendents and principals across the country and state leaders across the country are. And so there's big questions about the use of facial recognition technology for health information, use of consumer apps or data tracking apps for contact tracing. How is that data stored? Who is the steward of that information? There are, and again, this intersectionality of health data and PII, and the intersection of FERPA and HIPAA are something that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to. I note just in the space of the work that we do, where more than 40% of our students are students with IEPs and are students who are identified as complex learners, having to solve these issues very quickly around how do we share IEPs, how do we have confidential case notes, how do we obtain parental consent. These are all things that traditionally have happened within the school building, and are stored in the school building and are stored in locked file cabinets and so on and so forth. And so as schools and districts across the country think about the provision of special education services and those legal documents like IEPs, 504s, case notes for counseling, I think we're going to see a rise of students who are dealing with traumatic stress exponentially coming back in the fall. It's something we need to be really attentive to in terms of counseling resources. But again, how are we securing that data? How are we doing it in an accessible way? There are ways to do this from a data modernization perspective. There are ways to use the cloud to share information in a really restrictive permission setting way. But we need to teach people how to do it. And so I hope you'll come back to me after we get an answer from my esteemed colleague in Colorado. But to talk a little bit about the steps that I think schools should be taking this fall and even this summer to get ready for the road ahead.
Yep. Yeah. Offer accepted, Erin. We'll definitely come back to you to hear how that's going. But Marcia, any other new forms of data and technology that you see on the horizon that you think have important privacy considerations that we should be aware of?
I think in this area, I mean, I totally agree with Erin. There's, I think it is going to go up exponentially with any of the new forms, and there's a lot of requests. We're getting more and more requests to connect certain kinds of data across different agencies, across different data sources to provide more information for schools and districts and policymakers to make decisions on. And just that alone is going to create some more challenges when it comes to privacy, just because you may have two sets of data that are okay on their own, but once you start putting them together, then you end up with some new privacy, potentially some risks. So, I mean, even something as seemingly simple as that can present a new problem. And I think, again, it's happening fast enough. The technology part of it is happening fast enough that probably the understanding and the awareness and the training is not keeping up with it. So I also am a little concerned about districts' ability to take advantage of some of this unique technology in the right way. So even if they can take advantage of the newer technologies, do they have the resources to actually understand how to do it the right way? And can they put the right kinds of policies and procedures in place with that technology? So along with, Erin's recommendations on like what technologies schools can do, we have to keep in mind that they don't all have any resources or enough resources to do that. So we just have to make sure that we're all helping them and we all can help support that from a resource point of view.
Yeah, I think that's great. So I would love to pivot to, I think we've named a number of challenges and some things that maybe didn't go as well as we would have liked, but I think it is a good time to pivot to, looking ahead. What are some of the things that you all are thinking about? Feel free to chime in on any of the recommendations I added and whether you agree or not with them. And then one sub request in that question, we did get a question from participants, and just a reminder to please continue chatting those in. And thinking ahead, the question is about specific practices that work for video conferencing. In particular, thinking about student images, what can be seen in the background, taking screenshots. We had a version of this question that asked about, in particular, concerns about undocumented students. So it seems like video conferencing isn't going away. So if you could speak generally to, some of the things that you're planning, and then if there's anything specific to video conferencing and privacy that you have adopted in terms of best practices or resources that you use, please offer those too.
Great. So thinking ahead, couple things that I would say as we're thinking ahead and moving forward. I'll tackle the video conference thing first, and then just give some general resources and things. So for video conferencing, we both use the Zoom platform and we use Google Meets at Brooklyn Lab. And we trained our staff and had them go into a PD where we not only addressed privacy and security and how to actually turn on features and set features within those two platforms, but we also taught them how to use many of the built-in accessibility features that exist, from captioning to, the ability to have a transcript of the chat, the ability to use those tools from an accessibility perspective. Those tools are embedded in those platforms, but if you don't know how to turn them on and you don't know that they're there, you're not going to be able to use them. And there's some great resources on educatingalllearners.org, which can take you through those those setups. If anyone wants our 15-minute quick training slides, I'm happy to send them to you as well to deliver to your staff. You know, we also created some Zoom backgrounds so that, and Meet backgrounds so that, and they were super fun. They were Brooklyn specific. So we had a fun Nets background, and we had a Brooklyn Lab logo, and also taught students how to install those so that folks couldn't see the background of where they were, be it a homeless shelter or in their own house. The other thing that we have done at Brooklyn Lab for years is use the Common Sense Media digital literacy and digital citizenship platform. So we re-unlocked that class and allowed students to take that for extra course credit. We deploy it every fall, but it's for all grades K through 12. And one of the things that I think is really important and incumbent upon us in this moment is not just to think about what we can do to protect students' privacy and security, but what students can do to protect their own privacy and security. And how do we use this as a moment to educate and empower rather than just sort of deliver? I think it's a huge moment. To that other piece of it, we've done a ton of work with parents to let them know how to protect their students' privacy, to ask them not to share screenshots, to not take pictures of their students doing online learning where someone could see the entire class. And so we actually held a photo contest and it had specific rules. And then the winners got a gift card to a local Target, the winners, and it was parent winners. We also used the shameless plug for the CDT November 2019 guide to parent privacy. So great resource from this host organization. And so the things we've done, I think that anybody could do is having a point person in the school. It doesn't need to be the tech director, but you need to designate somebody who knows the issue and is interested in student privacy and someone people can go to with questions. You have to train your staff. This is as important as academics or what reading curriculum you're developing. You must train your staff. And our friends at FPF and the Student Privacy Compass have just debuted a multi-part module on training for educators that's free. So I would plug that. You need to have folks who know the law and that you're adopting community norms. So even so much as saying to have teachers not ask students to turn on their camera if a student doesn't have their camera on. I think we need to assume the best. And so teaching a teacher not to ask for those pieces if students aren't willing. Maybe there's something going on that they don't want to show you and that they don't want to show their classmates. Mm-hmm. I can't say this enough. Talk to parents. Parents are educators. I am for sure an amazing pre-K4 teacher now. I feel like I could nail the plant unit next year for sure. But parents are our infantry now in home learning. So are siblings and other types of guardians. And so having the conversation openly, honestly, and transparently with parents is a great way to do that. And you can lean on folks like the Data Quality Campaign, which has great infographics that are perfect for low literacy environments that you can actually show parents how important student data is, but also how to protect it. And then the last resource I'll plug is this summer, our partner ISTE is leading a four module professional training about how to teach in a remote and blended instruction environment, 13 hours of classes. The last one is one we're developing, the last module is one we're developing with the Educating All Learners Alliance and the 50 organizations that are a part of that. It's about working with special student populations, ELs, low connectivity student populations, students with disabilities. You can get 13 hours of CE credit. I think it's about $20, but it's a really amazing way to have educators have very focused content that can maybe fill that training gap in a way that a school doesn't have to scramble to do that professional development when teachers return in August or September. So those would be the tactical, practical, operational steps that I promised I would share with the students. I hope that that's helpful.
It's very, very helpful. So thank you. And I think, with my old state hat on, there are a number of those things that I would be like, okay, we're doing this now. I think other folks who are in similar roles on this webinar are thinking about those things too. Marcia, anything that you would add in terms of looking ahead, steps that maybe you can speak to this at the state level to complement some of the work that Erin's talking about at the local level to continue to use data and technology, but also protect privacy?
Yeah, and we don't, at the state level, obviously, we can't do quite as much, direct help. So all that sounds really appealing to me. But at the state level, what we, at least in Colorado, what we can do is provide resources to districts, and we can provide resource, like places. So all of those areas that you listed are great suggestions for us to help our districts learn more about it. But I would add another element of this, and that is within the state agency itself, we've got people that don't fully understand the privacy implications. And they also get questions from the districts, from their respective areas. So that's one area that I think is worth mentioning, that we have to make sure that when we have the process, you will build a process for supporting the districts, that we make sure to include the privacy pieces in it, and so that other staff at the SEA understand that just as well as they do their own area of expertise, so that they can either provide the guidance the districts need or send them to the privacy team that does. So that's an area where I feel like we've been a little challenged just because it hasn't quite intersected in the same way as it has with COVID. I think we have formal online schools, and we have an online unit that supports them, but formal online schools are very different than the schools now that are trying to do we're teaching remotely. Those are two very different things, and it's a little bit difficult for some of our colleagues to understand that difference, because they don't, we haven't really been in this environment before. Yeah. So that's one area is focus on that, because we're getting a lot of questions about, we would like to have an in-person class, but we want to have half of the people be able to join remotely. Yeah. So that brings up questions that you guys were just talking about, like, okay, so we're probably going to use a video conference tool or maybe LMS, but we don't want to be recording it, because once you post it afterwards, you've got a problem, so it's the exact kind of concerns you were just talking about, but it's coming up in a slightly different way. So that would be one area I would suggest looking at.
Great. So we have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to try and end on a hopeful note, and ask, I think you've done a beautiful job of laying out what some of the challenges have been, how you've thought about addressing them. I would love for your last remark to maybe be either something that you think has gone really well, that you're proud of and that you think other places might be able to adopt, or one piece of advice you would give to a colleague who is trying to navigate similar concerns. So hope, or excuse me, something you're proud of, or a piece of advice.
I'll let Erin go, or no? You go.
Either one. Why don't you lead off? I've led off twice. I have to think about it. One is hard for me.
Okay. Finding one is a little bit of a challenge, but one of the things that we did, and I think most states are trying to do this, but there was a request to support the electronic benefits transfer system with for SNAP and some of the social programs, and to get that put in place quickly because we needed to get benefits to the kids as soon as possible. And this involved coordination between our agency and Human Services. And it was a lot of work because it was a lot of comparing of data, and they needed to know who was eligible. So they needed our data from a free and reduced point of view, and then they handled the actual benefits. So we were able to do that. We had a lot of, my privacy team totally rocks. They worked on this and worked with CDHS, and it was a little bit painful because we did have to go through the agreement phase and put all those things in place, but we managed to do it fairly quickly, and the kids got the benefits. So I think that was one that we felt good about because at least we were able to get something real, something done that kids could actually benefit from in a fairly short period of time.
Yeah.
So I'd throw that one.
Immediately helped families. That's a great example. Erin, what about?
Yeah.
So I always go back to something from my days doing disaster recovery, which is, the Chinese word for crisis is the two characters that are danger and opportunity in the Chinese language. And so out of every crisis, we have both the danger that we need to confront and the opportunity. And so I'm incredibly excited to remake the table, to invite new alliances between disability organizations and civil rights organizations to capture this moment where youth are finding voice in really different ways and are finding ways to express themselves through digital identity and also, in their civic discourse. And so I want us, when we're thinking about these issues, to remember to keep students and parents at the center of the work. And if I can give anybody one piece of advice, is it's not just about what we do in the school building. It's about who we are as a community of schools. And so think about the opportunity that this presents you with to reimagine the relationships that you have with students and parents and really engage in that dialogue.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Okay, so I have the unfortunate job of wrapping us up. We are at our hour. I know I could and have talked to you for much more time than we did today about many of these issues. So let me just start by thanking Erin and Marcia. I mean, you guys have such vast experiences, and I just really appreciate all of your comments. And maybe just to build on Erin's point, like always centering the students, which is, what I look to both of you to do, and appreciate, how you approach these issues. To our participants on the webinar, I hope you found this helpful. As I mentioned, we have released a number of resources, including an online privacy module that is targeted towards state and local practitioners to hopefully be a one-stop shop, easy to share, training that you can share with your staff to navigate some of these issues. And if there are other things that we can do in our role at CDT to be helpful, please reach out and give us ideas, suggestions, ways that we can plug in and be helpful. We very much want to take our expertise and our knowledge and find ways to serve students and their families in this moment. So with that, in the slides that we'll send around, there are a number of resources, some of which have been mentioned, that can be helpful during this time. And just thank you again for your time and your participation, and for all of the work that you're doing on behalf of students and their families. Have a good rest of the day.